Good morning, folks. This is Instructor Gaynor. I will be saying some words about the chapter on morality and religion in Russ Shafer Landau's book, The Fundamentals of Ethics. Want to make sure that you get the main ideas here. Now, one note I want to make that is not in the textbook, but to sort of explain what I take to be the author's rationale for making this the first chapter in our textbook that is concerned with what area of ethics? We are making the segue from value theory, theories about the good life, theories about happiness, to theories about what is a good way to comport yourself, what is right conduct, and how do we determine what defines right conduct. The first chapter on normative theory is on morality and religion. Some of you have probably already surmised this, but the rationale behind why he likely started normative ethics this way is that for many people, their first encounter with morality is through their what? Is through their religion. If your experience was anything like mine, and you were brought up with some version of Christianity, you were likely taught the what? I'll just abbreviate. The Ten Commandments. These are moral laws about how you should comport yourself, authored by whom? The tablets given to Moses on the Mount, the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife or thy neighbor's ass, and the things of this nature. Thou shalt not make false gods, and we won't go into all the detail. But a whole lot of rules, well, not too many rules, by which one ought to conduct one's life. Now, of course, we also have the story of Jesus about the law being reducible to what? Love thy neighbor. Now, these are many people's first encounters with morality. So it's sort of no wonder that many people, when they look to their moral truths, will look to their religion, because it's sort of been taught to them that way. Now I'm sort of going to get into some of the meat of this chapter. Now, the author discusses the fact that when you are trained to think of morality as being a set of laws, and hopefully you thought meaningfully about this question, when you're taught to think of morality in terms of laws, implicitly, one might think what? Therefore, there must be a what? A lawgiver or a lawmaker. And you'll see this in the author's account. The author contends that given people's definition of God, and remember, what are we presupposing here about God? If you've taken an intro to philosophy class or a comparative religions class, you heard this before. This will be a retread. But the idea that most monotheistic religions put forth is that God is singular. God is one. By the way, God is also usually conveyed as a what? As a being of sorts. We can speak of God by analogy as being a person, even though God is not a what? Is not literally a person like we are. We speak of God anthropomorphically. So it's kind of no wonder that when we speak of God as a lawmaker, analogies are made to what? Leaders on our earth making laws. Ergo, you ought to follow them. God is a singular being I'm going outside the book to clarify a bit. God is typically defined as infinite perfection, which explains for people why only God would be up for the task of creating the moral law. Because if God is infinitely perfect, and these are the traditional Christian accounts of God's perfections, God is said to be omnipotent. That's just fancy Dan for all-powerful. As the creator of all things, God would have also created morality, since God technically created everything that exists. That's how this argument goes. God is said to be omniscient, which is said to be all-knowing or perfectly wise. Only God would have the wisdom to create the one true morality, according to this view. And then finally, I'll say this loudly for those of you who aren't nearby. God is said to be omnibenevolent. If you don't like that phrase, omnibenevolent, perfect benevolence. In other words, perfectly good. In other words, wants only the best for his creation. Now, this is among the reasons why many people think that religion is necessary for morality because of the necessity of a lawmaker. Now, keep this in mind, folks. There are some people who believe that there are moral laws that are part of the fabric of nature. But guess what? We don't think a God is necessary to have constructed them. And by the way, the likes of the ancient Greeks, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle would make arguments like this. Instead of thinking of the law coming down from an authority, the humanistic Greeks tended to think that we could discover the fabric of reality by employing what ability that we all have. Reason. We could use our reason to uncover the kinds of things that are most conducive to living a good life. And by extension, we could uncover the kinds of ways of life that are conducive to living very badly. In other words, we could discover these things where? Yeah, we could discover them on our own. We could discover them on our own. Now, I'm answering the question at the end of the chapter that I did not assign to you, but the author asked. Are there ways of constructing a notion of there being moral laws without there being a divine overlord who imposed them on reality? Some ancient Greeks believed that they just might be part of the fabric of reality itself. Ergo, there can be moral laws, and we can even talk about them that way, without thinking of them in terms of there being some author of them. They just might be part of the awesomeness of reality. Now, I think that's problematic for some people, because most of us tend to think how. I'll write this on the board. Most of us are trained to think anthropomorphically. This word is not in the text. Anthropos is from the Greek meaning pertaining to the human. In other words, we are trained from the time we were very small to think of God as being a sort of being. You know, the whole analogy of God being like a king. And of course, this is going to sound a little bit flippant, but many young people are trained to think of God as the big man on a throne in the clouds. Many young people. Many adults never grow out of that way of looking at God. And I think partly because to think of God conceptually is actually kind of philosophically sophisticated. But number two, Because we keep using the metaphors of God being a king and going to another place, where God will be ruling and so forth. So it's no wonder that people tend to think of God as anthropomorphic, as being like a big man in the clouds who gives laws. Many people have difficulty conceiving of the idea of laws that could have come about without a so-called lawmaker. And I'll reiterate, basically 30 seconds, and I'll reiterate, they contend that only God would have the power to do it, only God would have the wisdom to have done it, and God would have done this out of God's love. In other words, God's not wanting us to suffer. God's giving us the moral law for our own good, according to this count. Mr. Dukes.
I don't know if this is relevant, but about the laws and the lawgiver. Okay, you said that we're trained from little to.
Most of us are, anyway.
Okay, now if you examine the one thing where in the commandments you said thou shalt not steal, people inherently automatically know that they don't like it. Some say an animal, and he makes a fresh kill, and or the animal makes a fresh kill, and another one tries to take it. Therefore, I guess saying that he's trying to steal it or take it from him, that animal automatically knows it doesn't like that. It reacts to that. Now, with a baby that doesn't have training, if you take something from that baby, even though it can't talk, right, it will get upset automatically. So isn't that something automatically?
You know what Mr. Dukes is implying here? And I hope I'm not reading in. But yeah, it turns out that whether or not there is an overlord making these laws, many of these things that people call the divine laws are things that many of us would automatically come up with. And we would come up with many of them, not because God commanded it, but because we think that these rules kind of make sense independently on their own. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I don't know if you were implying this too, but Mr. Dukes is implicitly talking about what's known as the Euthyphro dilemma. Mm-hmm. Now let me mention this. Or I should say, I'll get to the Euthyphro dilemma in just a minute. The two things I want to talk about before I get there, though, is the author of the text has a conversation about the fact that many people will say not only could only God be the author of those laws, but they claim that religion also provides the necessary motivation to get people to be moral. Now, what is the author getting at here? And by the way, not all religions teach this. They're mostly talking about the Abrahamic religions here. Many of our Eastern and South Asian religions don't talk this talk. However, I was brought up with fire and brimstone. I'll cut to the chase here. I was told from a very young age that if I didn't repent of my sins and ask for salvation, that I would burn eternally in hell. I'll continue. I was also told that God is sort of like CCTV. You watch British crime dramas? Yeah, CCTVs everywhere. In other words, God is watching you, and He is recording everything that you've done to be broached on what day? Judgment Day. But He's not only CCTVing you. Where else is He able to look? He can even read your mind. He can read your perverted thoughts and hold those against you too. So in other words, cut to the chase, I had the hell scared into me at a very young age. And by the way, little Johnny behaved very well. He obeyed his parents. He honored his mother and his father. He did all the good things. But there was not one lick of morality in little Johnny. It was what the author of our text would say, make the distinction. Religion can get people to behave well. But guess what? Most of us don't think merely doing it because you want a golden ticket into heaven is a moral reason. Most of us think that a moral reason for being moral is to do it because of what? Thank you, yeah. You should be doing it because it's the right thing to do. It seems to me I was only behaving well out of radically selfish motivation because I didn't want to get slapped by my mom or my dad. And ultimately, I didn't want God to give me the slap down. As a matter of fact, I was hoping very much to get to the place with the streets made of gold. If you grow up on the wrong side of the tracks, it's understandable that you're looking for the streets made of gold. Get what I mean? Because if you're a have-not in life, you're told that heaven is the place where you will have the material things. But of course, these are all very selfish motivations. Even if they are natural motivations, they are nonetheless selfish motivations. I did not deserve what I call a moral gold star. Because I was really just behaving because of what I could get out of the deal. It's what some people would call doing something consistent with what morality would tell us, but doing it for what some call non-moral reasons. The philosopher Immanuel Kant will discuss this. We'll talk about this a little bit later on. It will come up again. So yeah, the author says people who argue only religion could get people to be moral sort of misses the point. Simply because it could make people behave well doesn't mean that it's getting people to be moral. And number two, remember the issue wasn't what can get us to be moral. The issue is what is the source of morality and how do we define what makes morality morality. Now, the author has a discussion of divine command theory in the text. Most philosophers do not approve of divine command theory for the very same reason that Plato didn't approve of it. And for those of you who did your reading, hopefully you took a look at that Platonic dialogue where one of the main conversations is about whether things are good, pious, things the gods admire. Are things good because the gods approve of them? Or do the gods approve of certain things because they are what? Because they are good. Now, the author of our text is blunt, and because we don't have much time, I'll be quick and blunt about it. If indeed we say that things are good simply because God commands it, we are suggesting that absolutely anything that God would command would be thereby defined as what? It would be therefore good and therefore moral, regardless of what God would command. Now, folks, most of you know that in the Old Testament, if you're from a Christian background, that one institution that I imagine none of you consider to be moral was allegedly, or at least believed to be approved by God. Slavery was an institution that was believed by the people at the time to have been approved by God. Now, most of you probably don't believe that. Now, let's suppose that God actually did approve slavery. I doubt that any of you would say what? That slavery is therefore good. Now, I imagine some of you would say God would never approve it. Well, guess what? If you say God would never approve it, you're not making a case for the divine command theory. You're making a case for the viewpoint of Socrates. Socrates would say, The gods love certain things, not simply because they arbitrarily love certain things, but he loves those things because they are what? Because they are good. In other words, what is good and what is righteous is actually independent. God loves certain things because they are good. They are not simply good because God says so. And by the way, you're all rational beings. Most of you would say because God said so really isn't a what anyway. Yeah, it's not a good reason. Not a reason that rational people would count. Now let me give you an example that's not in the textbook, because I think examples tend to help. Many of my Christian friends believe that abortion is an abomination in the eyes of God. And by the way, there is no verse in the Bible that expressly says that. As a matter of fact, it is what? It is the way they have interpreted the text. They have interpreted it in that way. But let's say it were in the text. Abortion is immoral and an abomination unto God. If I ask that person, excuse me, why do you think abortion is immoral and an abomination in the eyes of God? I don't think that person would say, because God said so. As a matter of fact, I think that person might pull the line from a bumper sticker and say, because it stops the beating hearts. And then I'll explain what that really means. Because it destroys a life that has inherent value in and of itself. In other words, they would actually give me a what? They would give me a reason that was somehow separate and distinct from God's commands. Because if you believe that God's commands make it so, guess what you don't believe you need? You don't believe you need reasons. But most rational people think that we do need reasons. And they think that God does have reasons. Which is what tells me that many people who think they believe in the divine command theory are mistaken. Otherwise, they wouldn't waste their time giving reasons. Because giving reasons would be a waste of time. This is why I would contend, most people think the divine command theory is wrong. Because it would make God's will arbitrary. Wait a minute. This is how the supporter of the divine command theory might argue back. But God is perfect. His will could never be arbitrary. So just because of God is the way God is, God implicitly does have reasons. And God would know those things. Now, folks, the rebuttal of that would be, well, that's just a circular argument. Because you kind of already done what? And don't miss this on the exam or the quiz. The author says, given what we've already talked about, the person who tries to connect morality and religion has already made a whole lot of assumptions. And I could probably go through a laundry list of these assumptions. A, that there even is a God to begin with. Remember, believers take these things as articles of faith. These are not proven. And I have written here that God cares about us and about morality. Folks, keep in mind, the author suggests if religion were necessary to morality, then we would expect there to be zero moral atheists in the world. But guess what? Most of my friends who are atheists are among the most decent moral people I know. The source of their morality is reason, rather than divine commands, nor their fear of burning in hell for it. I'm not saying that the reasons for being moral are not partly selfish, though. Because most rational people realize if you treat other people decently, they are likely to reciprocate. If you treat other people like garbage, they're likely to reciprocate. In other words, rational people have reasons to be reciprocally moral, regardless of whether or not there are divine rewards or not. How about living a decent life in the here and now? I guess is the answer. Some of us think that a moral life, treating others decently, actually benefits us in the here and now. Some of us don't need a religion to keep us in check. In other words, my own rationality keeps me in check. Because I happen to think that a decent moral life is actually in my long-term best interest, even in my short-term best interest. And keep in mind, we'll be talking about a whole lot of other normative theories, and take a guess what none of them will require. Not one of them will require religion. Not one of them. We will talk about a lot of reasons for being moral that have nothing whatsoever to do with religion. Oh, well, I forgot to mention this. Please don't forget this. The author brings up deists as an example of people who believe in a God, but they don't believe in a God that cares for us. By the way, this is the word. Deism. What famous American was a deist? Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson believed in a God, a rational being that created the universe like a giant machine, wound it up like a clock, and then said what? Hands off. Because it already is well wound and well ordered, God doesn't need to intervene anymore. But yeah, there are people who believe in a God, but don't believe that God necessarily cares about us, nor that God is the arbiter of morality. Deists tend to think that view I was talking about before, that we can discover what is moral by using our rational capabilities for doing so. Now, the author goes even further. The author says, how do we know that we even have what? How do we even know that we have the right religion? Let alone the right what? Let alone the right interpretation of the text. Folks, I don't know how many different denominations that there are of Christianity, but it's a ton. And guess what? There are some people who self-identify as Christians, whose viewpoints are very different from other people who self-identify as Christians. They, generally speaking, have the same divine revelation texts, but yet they interpret things very differently. The same way a Christian today is likely to interpret the text differently than someone 1,000 years ago in medieval Europe might have interpreted some parts. So even if you accept the idea that religion is an important source of moral guidance, you would still have to ask the question, well, how do you know that you have the right religion? And it's probably not lost on you that the reason why most people think they have the right religion is because they were brought up with it. And by the way, folks, that's actually kind of arbitrary. Because I recognize that if I were brought up in some other part of the world, I would likely have been brought up with some other religion, and I would be just as cocksure that my religion was the right religion as many people are that their brand of Christianity is the right religion. Yeah, how can you be sure you have the right religion? How can you be sure that you have the right interpretation This is what the author talks about when he's talking about, well, there are some people who might admit, even if religion is not a necessary thing for morality, religion is, however, a very important source of moral guidance. He says, well, keep in mind, a lot of the guidance of religion isn't necessarily all that moral anyway. And you know where I'm going with this? God's commanded a lot of problematic things. In some cases, God commanded what I regard to be murder. He commanded his people to murder people.
You're about saying eye for an eye?
Oh no, that's not even where I'm going. I'm talking about the massacre of the Midianites from the Old Testament, where he said to slay all of the men. They weren't making war with anybody. He said to slay all the men. Take the women who have never lain with a man as your concubines, and to take them and the children and to make them what? Your slaves. Now this is a line that many atheists point out to say God is not what? God is not good. And I'm specifically referring to Richard Dawkins, who is, I guess, one of the most well-known advocates of what's called the new atheism. In other words, atheists who are not willing to be accommodationists, as well as atheists who want to say science and religion are not really compatible with one another. Because religion actually makes claims that are what? That downright go against scientific fact. So this wishy-washy, but it's metaphorically true. Well, guess what? Which ones, tell me which parts of the Bible are true and which ones are only metaphorically true. Can you do that? Now you can see why some critics will argue that no, it can't be a source of morality. Because in many cases, many things that are claimed to be moral, a lot of us would say are probably not moral. Like giving a stamp of approval for slavery in biblical times. I think few of us would ever say slavery was ever truly what? I think it was always immoral. And I don't need a God to tell me that. Because it treats human beings as if they are what? As if they are nothing but property, objects. You don't need a religion to tell you that. As a matter of fact, religion often says, slaves, this is Paul of Tarsus, slaves, obey your master. You've seen that line, right? That troubled me. That troubled me as a teenager. And my pastor had no answer for me. At least he was wise enough and honest enough to tell me he didn't have an answer for me. And I appreciate that. Instead of a person telling me I'm stupid and a sinner for even asking the question, which is what I was told when I was yay big when I asked questions. It was a different church, by the way, just to let you in on that. Now, unfortunately, we are almost out of time. I do want to make sure that you understand that at the end of that discussion, the author discussed that Psalter position, where some religious might say, while religion is not necessary as a source of morality, religion is nonetheless an important source of moral guidance. The author will argue, well, how do you know you have the right religion? What about people who are moral without what? Are moral without religion? And what about the fact that religion, even the same religion, oftentimes has inconsistent points of view over time and so forth? If God is allegedly unchangeable and there is one true moral law, then why is God's tone seem to have changed at times? I mean, the polytheists didn't have a problem with this. Because for the polytheists, the gods didn't speak with what? did not speak with one voice. As a matter of fact, the ancient Greek gods sometimes what? They sometimes brawled with one another, went to war with one another, just like we do. So, I mean, it was understandable if things were chaotic and inconsistent. We'll come back to this a little later on. Best wishes.